Housekeeping. Thank you, she just did it for me. Some housekeeping rules. We're going to be recording the session, so just to let you know that. Fire escapes, please make yourself familiar with your fire escapes before we commence as well. So just to give you a little bit of context. So ESG, so environmental, social and governance, is often managed individually, but it's more recently been grouped together as one agenda. So seeing that environmental consideration is often prioritised. So let's unpick the importance there of what that levelling and balancing of the ESG agenda really looks like. So as global warming increases and the world stage commits to reduce emissions to limit the warming to 1.5, we're seeing the impact of this twofold. Firstly, we're seeing climate change and global warming. It's seeing the mass migration and displacement of migrants. It's estimated that there's 1.2 billion expected to be displaced as a result of climate change by 2015. What we see is then those displaced people are vulnerable to exploitation in many forms. We're seeing new emerging trends of civil litigation in relation to renewable energy sectors. As an example of Norway, where some wind farms were in violation of indigenous and community human rights, and their ability to, and they hindered their ability to practice their own culture. So as a result of the landmark case, we're seeing an increase in this space too. Our global commitment to limit global warming has seen the increase in the want for carbon neutrality, increasing our reliance on that cleaner and greener energy, such as renewables and wind and solar, increase our impact, increase our reliance on electric cars, and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But we need to understand what that impact of that commitment can have on those workers within the supply chain, again, often the most vulnerable. So just a couple of examples here to demonstrate this. So nearly 80% of the world's polysilica used in one of the core elements in solar panels are produced in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in the northwest China. The importance here is that this region is home to ethnic minorities called Uyghurs, and this minority has faced a myriad of human rights violations, including forced and bonded labour, housed against involuntary housed against their will, lack of freedom of movement, and for forced imprisonment, and faced a wide raft of human rights violations. And there's also evidence that these workers are now also involuntarily deployed wider across China as part of that state transfer program into other businesses as well in China. Electric cars, we're reliant on lithium in these batteries. There's several human rights violations around illegal land grabs of indigenous rights, of indigenous people's land, human right violations such as blockages of water to local communities, which impacts also the people, but the local wildlife and environment. An example of lithium mining, such as in the Lithium Triangle, which is Argentina, Bolivia and Chile, sees the release of toxic water, chemical leaks, again into the water supply, compacted with slave labour identified in the lithium mines in other areas of the world as well. With our demand on lithium set to soar in the next decade, these human rights violations will continue and grow. Cobalt, another example, mining for a mineral which is essential for our modern life. In that plight to be cleaner and greener, 60% of the global demand is sourced from the DRC, and is used in electric car batteries, technologies such as smartphones, iPads, laptops. And sourcing cobalt from this region specifically, as also in the production of it, has its own inherent risks. It's often mined from informal, small artisanal mines, often informal and irregular work. They're extremely dangerous. There's multiple of human rights violations, including forced labour, child exploitation, extremely poor health and safety conditions. There's been incidents of mines collapsing, and there's the expectation that it's a case of when the mine's going to collapse, not if, and it's not regulated. Or if there is regulation, it's not enforced. So you can see where the challenges are in this space to ensure that those who are impacted by our environmental consideration, those who mine, produce and make our goods and the materials to enable us to have a greener and cleaner environment, we need to be able to consider that their human rights are not a trade-off in favour of our environmental commitments, and that their rights and welfare are protected. And on that note, I'd like us to be able to have a discussion around this. So I'm delighted to introduce the wonderful panellists talking today, and they'll briefly introduce themselves. So we're going to talk about the balancing of that E and that S in a practical way. So first I'd like to introduce Laura. Laura's from SSE Energy. We then followed by Martha. Martha's also from SSE. We have Helen from Action Sustainability in the Supply Chain Sustainability School. And we have Joanna Carson, who's a Senior Advisor in Human Rights and Supply Chain from Slave Free Alliance. Welcome, ladies. Delighted to be able to be moderating this panel today with you. If we can just start with some couple of brief introductions. Laura, if you could give just a brief introduction, and then the rest of you three ladies, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, great. Thank you and good morning. Thanks for having me. So I'm Laura Cooper. I'm the Supply Chain Sustainability Lead for SSE Renewables. So my job is really to ensure that the work that we do globally with our supply chain is done in a sustainable way, both from an environmental and a social point of view. So I cover all jurisdictions for SSE Renewables, which includes the UK and Ireland, as well as Southern Europe at the moment. And then I also cover all of our technologies. So you talked there about some of those, Eleanor. So yeah, solar, battery, onshore, offshore wind and hydro as well. So really pleased to be here and part of this conversation today. Thanks,
Laura. Martha.
Hi, everyone. Well, Laura set the scene pretty well, but just to introduce myself too. So I'm Martha. I am Social Impact Lead at SSE Renewables. Laura's already given you a pretty good indication of what it is that we do. And my role, sort of very complementary to Laura's, is sort of really looking at how we can, on the one hand, drive positive social impact across our portfolios, both on site within the communities that we operate in, but also, of course, mitigate any social risks, including human labour rights risks. Part of my portfolio also includes the just transition. So I'm looking forward to expanding a little bit on that as we move forward in this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Helen, would you like to make an introduction?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. My name's Helen Carter. Sustainable procurement has basically been my vocation for the last sort of 30 years. So I am all about the supply chains. The last 10 years looking specifically at modern slavery and human rights, and work for Action Sustainability, a smallish consultancy, but we're also the delivery partner for the Supply Chain Sustainability School. So that's the area where we've been doing a lot of work in the built environment. We are part of the authoring panel for BS 25700. I'm leading the UK delegation for the ISO standard, so how businesses can combat modern slavery. And we've just launched with some insight from Slave Free Alliance, which was great, our solar panel procurement guide on how to procure that, looking at that responsibly. So yes, really looking forward to this conversation too.
Thanks, Helen. And finally, Joanna.
Thanks, Eleanor. So I'm Joanna Carson. I'm also a senior advisor here at SFA, and I work with a number of businesses across industries to address modern slavery and human rights in their supply chain. My background is primarily in international development, so implementing private sector programs in the tea, cocoa and garment supply chains.
Thank you so much, and it's really great to have such a wealth of experience and background to be able to support me on the make my life easier as the moderator, hopefully. So let's just kick off with a couple of questions. So I've got a first question, and I'm going to direct this one really at Martha and Laura in this space. So what are the global challenges, do you think? So I've given a couple of examples earlier, but what are the global challenges you think you're facing in relation to the balancing of the E and the S in your organisations? And then kind of twofold in that question, how are you trying to overcome that?
Oh, should I go first, Laura? Just while you're nodding. So coordinating between the two of us. No, that's a really important question. So I think mainly maybe just starting by setting that scene a little bit and building on what you said in your excellent introduction, Eleanor. So I think what's really important to acknowledge in this context is that you can't take climate action, that climate action is in some ways human rights action, right? I mean, we know that the most vulnerable are already on the front line of climate change. We know that it's often those most deprived who are already facing health inequalities or other kind of impacts from pollution. So just to acknowledge that climate action should be at its core also human rights action. And that doesn't mean that and then part of this discussion is how we mitigate and ensure that that brings about, opportunities as we go along, but just acknowledging that climate change is at its core fundamentally unjust, and the way, and that we have to make sure that we consider it in that respect. But having said that, as you also kind of acknowledged in your introduction, it's sometimes a bit challenging to think sort of about social and environment at the same time. I know sometimes sort of the human mind, I know how my mind works, we like to sort of operate in silos and sort of think about things separately, but they are fundamentally entwined and they are, of course, interlinked. Sort of from a company perspective, I think one of the challenges can be that sometimes social environment is sort of handled in different departments or kind of different sort of has different procedures. And I think for me anyway, that just also highlights like the critical importance of a sustainability team and a chief sustainability officer that can sort of really support companies and employees to sort of make sure that those kind of departments or those kind of elements are sort of talking to one another. So I think, that is certainly one way to sort of help support bridge that gap and sort of help employees sort of understand how the two kind of fit together as well. And I think what also can be challenging is, of course, like what environment and social means is also different in different companies and different contexts. For some, it might be sort of more in the context of, climate mitigation, reducing GHG emissions, biodiversity action, and then sort of that social can also be different. So those are sort of some of the sort of top level challenges. And I think one of the things that we've been doing at SSE Renewables sort of for the past sort of few years now is really trying to look at the E and the S, or sort of our transition to net zero, and how we support taking climate action through a just transition lens. And this might be a term that's familiar to quite a few of you on this call, I would imagine, but the just transition, how I see it, is a lens to looking at the social opportunities and risks for how you are taking climate action. So when you are putting together your net zero plan, making sure that you're actually thinking about, well, how is reducing my emissions in that part going to affect the employee that I might need to do that role? And vice versa, how might that affect the employee who I might not need to do that role? So it's kind of having that social lens to the transition and looking at how you sort of approach your net zero strategy. And that's, of course, not to say that that just transition is just sort of in the context of how companies look at how they're approaching their net zero or climate resilience plans. And this is a term that's been around since the 70s from the labor movement in the US, which was really fundamentally about how fossil fuel workers could sort of retrade in a way that was fair in that transition. So it is really deeply embedded in the labor movement, which is important to note. But having said that, particularly sort of over the last sort of, I would say, 5-6 years, that term just transition has become sort of a bit more all-encompassing, sort of on the one hand, including how do we make sure transitions to the E, so a green economy, etc., are fair and just for workers on the ground. But I think also we see that the human rights agenda is also now firmly embedded and underpins a just transition as well. And here particularly like making sure that net zero plan or whatever you are doing is also sort of respecting the fundamental human rights of the communities in which you're operating in. So at SSE back in 2020, we were the first company to develop our just transition plan, which was really exciting. And this plan sort of is founded on 20 principles. And one of the things that we did, which is a really helpful way of approaching it as a company, I think, is to sort of think about, well, what are the kind of social considerations when we transition in? So transitioning into that new net zero economy, into some of these new sort of business areas, and what do we need to think about when we transition out as well? So making sure you have both of those lenses essentially, and what are the social kind of risks and opportunities to workers as we transition in? So what kind of training, what could be some of these new jobs that we're talking about? We talk a lot about green jobs, which is really important, but also making sure that those jobs are good jobs, decent jobs, making sure that fundamental labor standards are upheld as we move into those new kind of realms as well. And then, so as said, so transitioning in, looking at the worker aspect, what does that look like? What could be some of the new skills, new jobs, new opportunities around that? And then also around communities. So how are we engaging with our communities, ensuring that community engagement is robust and transparent, and particularly around some of our new business areas, and also sharing value with communities is also a really important part of the just transition. I know at SSE, I think we spent around almost 300 million in our lifetime on community benefit funds. So that is a huge value to be shared with the communities that are sort of living around the assets that we're building. And then, of course, I know Laura will go on to touch upon this more, and I'll probably pass over to her now because I've probably been speaking for too long. It I'm very passionate about this topic. But of course, you know, those kind of social safeguards as well as we move into those new markets as well. So yes, to just transition in terms of our direct workforce, supporting upskilling, retraining where needed, also inclusivity across that pipeline, the way that we engage with the communities around us and share value, and of course having those social safeguards as we move into you know, new markets and also new supply chains, underpinned by, you know, internationally recognized frameworks that we've been using both in the context of the green economy and outside. But yeah, maybe Laura, I'll pass over to you on that note.
Thanks, Martha.
Oh.
Yeah, sure. So I'll pick up just probably a bit more on the supply chain element for SSE. That's a critical piece, but maybe just to pick up on one thing that Martha talked about as well, a real practical step that we've taken within SSE Renewables, specifically just over the last few months, in order to bring the E and the S together from a sustainability perspective, is that we've actually moved our environment team into the wider sustainability team. So where probably for most companies the health, safety and environment would sit together, actually through the development of our sustainability team, it seemed to make much more sense to have those teams that are on the ground dealing with those environmental issues fully embedded into the wider sustainability team, so that we can all understand how we bring all of that together, because actually there is a real social opportunity, if you like, through the work that we do from an environmental perspective. So that's a real practical step that we've taken, and it's definitely proving to be successful at this point. The team are kind of really coming together nicely. But I guess just in terms of the supply chain perspective for us then, you know, you've talked there about some of the kind of materials and products that have potential risks, and SSE definitely cut across the majority of that in terms of the technologies that we are involved in. So it's a really key area for us, right, to make sure that the way in which we engage with our supply chains right down to the very kind of first level is done in a sustainable way, right? And that we think about the materials that are being put into those products and assets that we buy and how we do that. I actually spent yesterday at Solar and Storage Live, which was my first appearance at a solar and battery event, but had some really good engagement with panel manufacturers there. We talked about the solar stewardship initiative and things. So really just seeing that industry coming together and thinking about how we map that stuff out, you know, what regions that we look to use and how we engage with them, was a really interesting conversation and quite eye-opening as well, actually, just to see the kind of the want for to do the right thing, right, but by those companies is really good. I guess in terms of the challenges, I'm not going to dwell on them too much. We know what they are. I guess in terms of what SSE has been doing over the last few years in relation to this. So a lot of work that we've been doing is in relation with SFA. So we've been working with you guys really closely for a good few years now on particular projects, shall we say, so where we kind of see our highest risks. So vessels in particular are obviously a big risk in relation to our offshore development. So we have a lot of vessels coming and going on those projects, and that's a really key area for us to kind of know about. So we've worked with those suppliers. SFA have done deep dive risk assessments with them. We've done interviews and engagements. We've, as a result of those and the kind of analysis that we've done things like enhance our living wage clause to ensure that people that are on vessels are also included in that when they're on our site. So that's a massive change for us and something that, you know, we're really proud of. Some of the other work that we've done more recently has been around our first solar project. So project Littleton, just down in the north of England. And again, we've done some really extensive work with Slave Free Alliance to do some deep dive risk assessments with the suppliers that are providing that, who I actually met with yesterday. And again, doing that kind of analysis, getting that engagement, I think is really, really key. One of the things that we're finding is that the more that we can talk directly with those suppliers without you know, a tier one or a principal contractor in the way, really have that direct engagement, just opens the door to much more transparency and visibility of their downstream supply chain as well. So I think that's really key for us, and certainly going forward, a lot of the work that we'll be doing with Slave Free Alliance going forward as well is that we'll be continuing on this journey of, you know, what does our best practice look like just now? How do we make that better? How do we implement that strategy? And actually, how do we get close by having kind of longer term partnerships with our key suppliers so that we can really work these things through? Nobody has the answer today or tomorrow. So it's all about that kind of longer term plan so that we can get to where we are now, understand that, but more importantly, acknowledge that there are risks, there are things that we need to consider, and that we do that together. We don't necessarily kind of put a whole host of requirements on them and walk away. I don't think that that's the right approach. I think one of the other key things for us is just very briefly is kind of standardization, right? The more that we can engage with things like Solar Stewardship Initiative, the more that we can have standardized requirements, means that us as a client, it makes it much easier to engage with these suppliers if everybody's asking for the same thing. If we're coming at them with lots of additional requirements, just makes it so much harder for them to engage with us if others are not doing the same thing, because it's easier for them to go and tender for that work. That's not what we want. We want everybody to be on the same playing field, you know, to have the same ticket to the match, as it were. That's a key phrase in SSE. So that's what we want. That's what we're aiming for. But it just in lastly, in terms of kind of bringing that E and the S together and how we balance that, one of the other kind of key things that we're looking at here is around circularity, right? So how do we actually negate the need for these raw materials, where these risks come? How do we reduce that so that we can actually reuse the material that we have? And so therefore, reducing that reliance on those communities and those Indigenous populations where we don't want to necessarily cause any further you know, land degradation and that kind of thing. And how do we then reuse the materials that we have and actually build a new supply chain, perhaps domestically grown or further afield, but actually how do we give further opportunities in different areas so that we can support that as well? So that's a really key thing for us too. So yeah, lots of work I would say in the pipeline that we've done, certainly more to do for sure, which I'm sure we'll pick up on later in the discussion, but some really key elements for us, and Slave Free Alliance have been a big part in our journey so far on that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Martha. So, and you've talked about some great mitigations in that space, but let's just take it back a little bit. So I'm gonna move over to you, Helen, and then and Joanna as well, if you have anything you'd like to add. But you know, where do we start? Like, we talk about where these challenges are, and you know, SSE have given some great examples of what they're doing, you know, understanding in this space and the mitigations. But you know, where can we start? Let's talk about that a little bit.
That's a good question, and I mean, I just literally say follow what the guys are doing, because it's a really good example of the processes that you need to take. I think one of the things that we have in terms of the challenges that are associated with this is, the last 10 years, we're still doing awareness raising. There's still a lot of awareness raising, and there's still a need to have awareness raising at senior level in organizations. And I think this links to compliance perceptions. There's a lot of legislation happening at the moment in this space. And interestingly, Laura, I was at Solar Storage last week, a couple of days on the Tuesday, presenting on there, but I did listen to a solar panel company that were talking about their ESG, and they had actually interestingly stuck supply chain transparency and modern slavery under the G, not the S. They'd stuck it under the governance because they saw it as a compliance and management issue rather than necessarily seeing it as the social issue. And I think that's what's really interesting through just transition, through ESG, is that what we're seeing is organizations doing the community in terms of local community at S level, but not thinking about the extended community in terms of those embedded supply chains. So I think the best place to start is to get real clarity of definition, real clarity of understanding of the issue, and actually fundamentally getting that at the top level in an organization, because obviously the steps that you need to take are going to be quite challenging. There is no easy solution to this. There is no tick a box and I'm compliant, and there never has been in this space. So I think that's a good place to start. I think the other thing as well is excuse me, trying to get organizations to understand the interconnectivity of things. So a little bit of like Martha's comment at the beginning, I've been doing sustainability now for about 30 years, and I'm still strongly of the opinion it is this balancing act of how we get that economic, that social, and that environmental consideration, and that we need to look holistically. And it's not tree hugging. It's not social, it's not social woke. It's basically thinking about the footprints we have as organizations that have an environmental branch, a social branch, not just an economic branch. So we need to make sure we're really clear that when we make a decision here, it has an unintended consequence if we don't think about it more rounded and more holistically. And some of it goes into business operations. So if we actually look at the geopolitical space right now in renewables, it's a really, really, really difficult area, and it's going to get more and more challenging over the next 5 or 10 years. Forget legislation, forget all of the due diligence legislation that's out there. We've got Chile who've basically said, we'll now make every single mine that we've got in Chile part of the government, and we will control how much lithium we're allowing to go out to the marketplace. China are doing exactly the same thing. Yeah. So the reality we have right now is that we've been sitting in this very entitled position where we've been able to get whatever we want at any cost. And now everyone's gone, oh, we hold the strings, we hold the minerals, we hold all of the things that we want. And it's not an easy conversation. So Laura's point about collaboration, excuse me, is also incredibly key. I think being a procurement person, for me, the other thing to think about is due diligence is not an audit. So again, thinking about how you integrate due diligence with your procurement in the right places, in the right gateways of your procurement activity, and realizing that as much as the market wants to commoditize solar panels, and by the way, it's not just solar panels, it's wind turbines, it's batteries, and it's not even in renewables, it's in everything that we buy. It's about having your risk assessment at the very beginning, when you're pulling your understanding of need around procurement and having the conversations at that outset and saying, is this something we should just be looking at price on? Are there other risks, other issues that we need to be considering that have to go into that value part? I hate putting it in value because it's actually not even value, it's intrinsically important. It's not an add-on, it's something we should be doing, it's a minimum standard. And then starting to think about that continuous improvement. So should we be moving to a more strategic output, exactly as Laura and Martha have been talking about? Solar panels have a massive challenge. You are not going to do that through price or contract condition. So our huge challenge, I think, from a due diligence perspective, is also ensuring that the lords and masters who've got the purse strings understand the implications of some of the decisions that they're making, and also then how we actually upskill everybody in procurement. I'm not just talking about buyers and commercial teams and everything else, but the people who are specifying and the people who are managing the contract have a role to play. So I suppose if you whittle that into sort of 3 things: increase awareness, embed it into your procurement psyche, into what that you're looking for. And I suppose my biggest piece of advice would be, don't rush. There's no quick fix to this. So you're looking for systematic change, and they're good places to start.
Thanks for that, Helen. That's really great. Joanna, have you got anything you want to add to that?
I think Helen, Martha and Laura have covered so much, but yeah, I think in terms of understanding your risk, that's so important. And I think just adding on to what Martha and Laura said around bringing the sustainability team over all those social and environmental factors together, I think is so important, because, you know, you might be doing 2 separate risk assessments, people having 2 separate focuses on those and never understanding the interconnectedness of those 2 issues. So actually having that function brought together, you would hope would be able to view it from a more holistic lens, as Helen put it. So I think that that's really, really important, and I love that they've done that. And in terms of just understanding your supply chain as well, I think starting to map your supply chain as well is so important. How can you know where your risks are if you don't know who you're sourcing from and where you're sourcing from? Just from my experience, I've worked with companies where there's been a human rights challenge in an area and they haven't known whether they are sourcing from that area, sourcing from that supplier, and it's caused much bigger issues, and it causes panic and they don't know how to respond. And so I think really also being able to start mapping your supply chain is so important.
Can I just add Can I just add something to that, Eleanor? I think understand the difference between supply chain and who you buy from is actually really important. I saw a really interesting comment by SIPS where they talked about a very large ICT company who were very proud that they understood 99% of their supply chain. And when you actually read the article, no, they understood 99% of who they were buying stuff from, not the supply chain. The supply chain is everything embedded underneath it. So I think that's a huge challenge for businesses in terms of we need to start moving away from buying to understanding that there are supply chains with impacts associated with it. So I think it's a great point, Joanna, in terms of mapping, but also understanding what we mean by the term supply chain it's just a basic start, really.
Yeah, you're so right, and it's so important. Thank you both for contributing there. And in terms of then, so we've already started to talk and touch upon so well in terms of those practical steps that you're taking to address this complexity. So Martha, Laura, I know you've already kind of given us some really great ideas in terms of, what that looks like. I particularly like the bringing the environmental under the same pillar in the same team as the social. And, it's a great way to implement that. But just give me a little flavour of a couple of other practical steps in this space to be able to kind of mitigate that risk.
Yeah, so I'll take that probably just first off from a supply chain point of view, and then hand over to Martha for some further comments. But as Helen said, we can't rush this, right? I've been doing this job for SSE Group now for nearly 6 years. It's taken a long time to embed even the most fundamental of requirements through things like, sustainable procurement code, like even just getting that in place. So thinking about, what is it that we expect as a company, and how do we articulate that to the supply chain so that they understand exactly what it is that we're looking for, right? Because that's a really critical part, is that we can ask for lots of things. One, if we're not going to do anything with them, there's no point in asking. And two, if suppliers are not clear on what that expectation looks like, then they're never going to be able to deliver. So even just putting those fundamentals in place took nearly 18 months just to understand what is it that we're asking for. And that's something we have to, update and refresh constantly in alignment with law and regulation and other developments that we have. So even just having those things in place has taken us this time. I think for us, the kind of other fundamentals that we do, picking up on Helen's point from a procurement perspective, is that alongside that code, we then have risk assessments based on our products and our assets that we buy and the categories that we use. That then helps us to develop appropriate tender questions. So again, we're in this space where we're data driven, right? So we want to know everything, and we want to send out tenders that are hundreds of questions long, and the supply chain need to respond to that time and time again. And it's exhausting, right? Nobody has the resource to do that. We're in a time constraint here. We're trying to build some of the largest, offshore wind farms in the world. We need to do that in a decent way so that suppliers have got the opportunity to provide a proper response that is meaningful to us and to them. So we do risk-based tender sets effectively, so that those are smaller tender sets that are based on the risks that we've already identified, depending on what it is that we're procuring. So that streamlines that situation a little bit. It then allows us to have that better engagement, right? So we then understand, not just a whole load of documents and policies that those companies have, but actually what does that mean for us at a project level? What does it mean for us during the delivery of this particular contract? And so therefore, how do we work together to ensure that we get the best outcome for both companies and for both organisations? So that's a kind of couple of the fundamental steps that we do. And then within a renewable space, I think the next kind of key thing for us, and we've done a little bit of this, obviously, with the work that we've done with Slave Free Alliance in terms of due diligence, but as Helen said, that's really key, right? Now, that's difficult. It's not something that you can go out and do. It's not something you can do the same way with every organisation either. So it's something that we've worked on. We've done these deep dive risk assessments. We've worked with the supply chain to do interviews and desktop assessments, and we've been on site and done some social audits as well on some of our UK construction sites, which is all great steps in the kind of, in that direction. But it's by no means a kind of structured and tailored approach, and it's by no means getting all the way down through the supply chain, and it'll take a long time to do that. But a couple of the key things that we're kind of doing in alignment with this, and for me, the kind of the E, the S, the G, all combines in such a way that for me, it really aligns, particularly the kind of social part of this and the human part of this really actually aligns to what we already do as an organisation from a health and safety point of view. So a lot of what we do is we talk about people, how we keep people safe on our sites, whether they work for us or whether they work for our tier 3 or 4 or 5 supplier, it doesn't matter. When they're on our sites, it's our responsibility to keep them safe. A big part of that should be their well-being, right? So by extension, thinking about people's well-being and understanding that, for me, brings in that kind of human rights aspect and that kind of wider social piece. So a couple of the other key developments that we're doing within SSE is that we're actually training our health and safety teams who go out and do their audits on vessels and on construction sites around what does a social audit look like. And it's not necessarily that we want them to go out and carry out a social audit. That's not the point of it. It's to be those eyes and ears on the ground to understand what are the kind of red flags? What is it that we should be looking for? Are there things that we maybe need to go back and have a look at and understand a bit better? So for me, it's a real extension of that health and safety, is that well-being piece is really key. So we'll be doing some of that training later on this year, and that'll be the kind of starter point. If it's successful and the teams are kind of, you know, able to embed that into their daily job, then it'll be something I think that we'll look to extend as well, because so far as I can understand, the more eyes and ears that we have in that space that have got that kind of training behind them, the better, right? Because it's more visibility, it's more understanding, it's more people that can come back to me or Martha and say, I think there might not be something right here that we need to go and check out. That's a huge step for us. One of the other key things that we're doing, just lastly, is probably around our supply chain, and it comes back to the standardization. What does good look like? There's not a one size fits all across sustainability, right? There are multiple platforms out there. We engage with lots of them, but one of the key things that we've done this year is we've entered into a contract with EcoVadis. So one of the key things that we'll be doing to try and give ourselves a bit of alignment around our supply chain is that we'll be using EcoVadis as a kind of platform. So getting our supply chain engaged with that. And I guess that just for us is starting to try and level the playing field there in terms of what does good look like? How do we engage with these suppliers? And how do we, again, get down to that next level, right? It's not about the tier ones, it's about, like you say, Helen, what's behind that, right? It's not who we buy from, it's who they buy from and who they buy from again. So that'll be a kind of changer for us, I guess, in terms of the way in which we get that data, understand it, and how we use it with the supply chain too. So that'll be something that we do kind of going forward.
Thanks for that, Laura. And then briefly, Martha, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, that was super extensive. It's funny actually, because just a disclosure, I'm quite new to the team, but having this discussion has made me think, particularly what we were talking about earlier about like how useful it is to have, you know, as many voices as possible in the sustainability team. You know, it really does enable that kind of like, because a lot of this we're talking about is, you know, understanding mitigating risk, but also, you know, importantly, generating value and opportunity as well, right? It's not all, yes, it's about risk mitigation, but there is also a lot of social impact to be made. And even by having those different voices in the team, you know, I can sit there and sort of talk about, listen to what we're doing on circularity and be like, you know, have you thought about this? And, you know, that kind of value in terms of potentially mitigating human rights risks. Also in terms of climate adaptation, have we thought about workers getting too hot potentially in some of the new countries that we're operating in? Biodiverse. So it's just, once again, I just wanted to underline that point that it is having those voices and having that social lens within the context of your E and G colleagues as such really is a value, and that's something that I've definitely already found being quite new in the role. One of the other things that I think is also important, and particularly in the context of this call, and when we talk about collaboration, and that is critical, both in terms of, you know, what we do domestically and also globally, but I think also having, you know, a strategic approach and also sort of thinking about which collaborations and multi-stakeholder initiatives can we sort of use to exert leverage on some of our key sort of priority areas. So actually, yes, to, you know, what we're doing in terms of due diligence, but of course, so much of that is in the context of collaboration. And also, you know, really, I'm really trying to understand, you know, what organizations and collaborations are we part of? Where are our key risks, and which are the key organizations that are actually really going to help us to move that agenda forward? Obviously, recognizing that ability to exert collective leverage is so important. And then maybe one final thing, just going back to what I was talking about earlier on the just transition and the program and the principles that I was talking about earlier, you know, these kinds of things are all very well and good, but they can't just sort of lie in thin air, right? And I think one of the important things as well is that defining those potentially cross-cutting principles for how your company is going to go through that transition, the net zero transition, or of course also climate adaptation, that whole E piece as such, and monitor your progress on it as well. And as said, be transparent about that. And I think what's been, you know, one of the things that we've done is we have a progress report on our just transition principles, and have quite transparently highlighted when we've done them and where we're doing them, and also where we also have a lot to learn and where we're sort of taking action moving forward. So I think, you know, being accountable, that kind of continuous improvement that we're talking about, and finding ways to sort of monitor how you are addressing the kind of E and the S is really important. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks, Laura. And I just want to move on to that. I'm conscious that I want to leave a little bit of time for questions as well, if there are any. And I could honestly probably sit here and talk to you guys for hours on this. I think it's quite obvious that we're also passionate and committed in this space. But Helen and Joanna, I just wanted to touch on the due diligence piece that, you know, Laura and Martha have done a great job of kind of articulating what they're doing in this space. But it'd be really interesting to understand, you know, in acknowledgement that, you know, SSE has said it's not an audit. So let's unpick that wider piece around what that due diligence, the importance of it, and, you know, why it's important for organisations to really kind of take hold of this point.
No, it's a really interesting point. Audit has a place and it's a role, but it's basically an enabler to allow due diligence to operate. And that's the way to think about it. So in the built environment, and I spent sort of 10 years of my life working at Carillion in auditing on health and safety. There are standards that everybody goes down. There's a tick box that you can go through, and everyone today, we are compliant. We've done what we need to do. When it comes to the issues of people, it's not that easy to do. You can have the best processes in the world, and fundamentally there are huge challenges with the fact that processes will go one way and people's behaviors will go a slightly different way, or completely different way, sometimes depending on the way the organization works. So we see this in evolution of health and safety with behavioral-based safety. You know, it's not so much more about have you got the nice certificates, have you got the nice audits, but actually, what are you doing to change the culture of your organization to address health and safety? This is no different. It's about ensuring that we have that, and I liken this when I talk about due diligence, having a hard line and a soft line. The hard line being the processes. They are the easy things to be able to identify. People can review them, people can check them, they can find gaps, and there are now standards out there to help, but it doesn't replace the need to have worker voice and conversation. And I think this is what makes things uncomfortable for businesses, because there's a couple of things that we all need to realize, that fundamentally anybody who puts in their policy that we have a zero tolerance to modern slavery and labor exploitation, and we don't accept it, obviously doesn't understand the fact that it is so prevalent in everything that we buy, not just renewables, but our personal consumption. So best practice is to start thinking about, have I got that due diligence system? And I have to speak to people who are affected by what we're doing. It's an uncomfortable conversation because sometimes they're going to tell you things you don't want to hear, but it is an important conversation to have. So, excuse me, the other issue that you're going to have is that in most cases, having that conversation and using it to have that sort of continuous improvement dialogue is something that most organizations, even international organizations where we can get a bit snooty thinking they don't care, they want to sit and have that conversation and understand how they can drive improvements. So using social audits is a powerful tool, but it's just a way to gather data. And we do know that, unfortunately, in renewables, you do have the biggest challenge now, where a lot of the issues that we're finding are in China. We do know that a lot of auditors are leaving China because it's now being deemed illegal to look too closely at organizations that are operating in that space. So actually, audits can no longer be just the only solution. And in fact, to a certain extent, accepting that if somebody gives you an audit report that basically says we are perfect and the only thing I've found is that I've got a yellow fire extinguisher by my door and it should be a red one is more of a red flag than an audit report that basically tells you I've got 50 things I need to go and have a look at. I would trust the 50 things more than the yellow fire extinguisher. So I think it's important that in procurement, people don't spend enough time doing things like supplier relationship management, supplier performance management, getting to understand what's underneath the bonnet, having those conversations, having the data that then drives those conversations. An audit is one pin in that sort of arsenal, if you like, of things to look at. And again, it comes back to my original point. This is not about compliance. This is much more complex than compliance.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't come off mute there. Thanks. Joanna, if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, just to touch on what Helen said around performance review meetings with suppliers, I think that's so important. That's something that we always recommend to the businesses that we work with, is really making sure that human rights is embedded within those discussions whenever you're having kind of supplier performance reviews, if there's KPIs related, all of those things, that you're creating that relationship and having that dialogue with your suppliers. But also something that we often work on is things like questionnaires that go out to suppliers, and something as well that we would always recommend if doing something like that is making sure that your questions are open-ended, because so often, you know, if it's too narrow, you might get, yes, we've got a modern slavery statement, but what's that actually telling you? And really keeping questions open-ended, you can get so much more information, actually understanding how a supplier or a company would mitigate risks if a risk was found, you know, really opening that dialogue to say, you know, risks do occur, but actually it's how you act on those, how you're trying to prevent them, but also how you respond when they occur is so important. So making sure that you're creating a space for that dialogue is vital. So yeah, due diligence, very important.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm conscious of time and I want to get some questions in. So I'm just going to throw out one question to the whole of the panel here. And I just want one sentence to think about. So it's a bit of a curveball. I didn't say one sentence when I briefed everybody. But what do you think needs to change? Helen, I'm going to go to you first. If you could think of what do you think needs to change in order for an organisation to level up in this space? What needs to happen?
That's one heck of a curveball. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I have this saying, and it probably is very inappropriate, but businesses need to put their big boy pants on and realise they have a responsibility to deal with these issues. Very simply, businesses are no longer operating in a space where they can't. So businesses need to take responsibility. They don't need to take responsibility for everything. The risk assessment helps them with that. I think that's important, but they need to take more responsibility than they're currently doing. Sorry, it's about 5 sentences, but hopefully that helps.
That was great, Helen. Does anyone want to add on to that?
I'll try and add on with one sentence. I think for us as an organisation, what would be helpful in this space is standardisation across the board in terms of what it is that we want from a government level, from a global level. How do we do that so that we are not the only organisation trying to push an extended agenda?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Martha or Joanna, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, it's difficult to follow the big boy pants. It has to be said. Yeah. So you've made it a tough one. No, but I think so. 2 things. So firstly, building on what Laura says. I mean, my first point before Laura spoke was we have a lot of things that can help us. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. This is, of course, a new, it is in some ways a new transition, but we have, well-established frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles and Business and Human Rights that are well equipped to help us navigate this new terrain. But having said that, even within that, there is a lack of standardization in how they're implemented and applied. So yes, to use what exists, but agreed that we need to be a bit clear on how to use them, so that we also know what to look for in our suppliers and also what we're doing. And then just going back to, I think, a running theme, that buy-in at the top, was it you, Helen? Another great phrase, the purse strings. Once again, it's all very well and good, having these discussions, but how are they being fed into the decisions that are being made? Yeah, so I think that's important.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Joanna, is there anything you want to add on the back of that before we open up for questions? Or
yeah, I completely agree with what everyone said so far, but just to highlight collaboration, we've highlighted collaboration internally, making sure that those people, the talent that you've got within your teams are really collaborating, but also leaning on external experts as well.
Wonderful.
Got to throw that in there.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor out to any questions and see if there's any questions that have come in at all. This one's for SSE. I've got a couple coming in.
Oh,
What we got? So Tom, thanks Tom. In what way has SSE approach to just transition influenced other companies or industries to adopt similar strategies or principles?
I'll take that. And Laura, please feel free to come in. I feel like that's interesting. I think so. In terms of just transition, you now have the World Benchmarking Alliance that have their sort of benchmarking report, which sort of looks at how companies are approaching the just transition. And I think the way that SSE has sort of approached that as being the first company to have a sort of report on how they're approaching just transition was sort of probably one of the key key enablers or key starting points to recognize that we do need to start measuring and sort of seeing how companies are sort of implementing and upholding the just transition. So I do think it has sort of led the way in that respect. But of course, what we do see is that it is still mainly in the context of the energy space where companies are talking about just transition. Of course, that makes total sense, right? But I think we also need to recognize that there are a lot of other sectors that are transitioning in different ways. And I don't know yet how much that just transition is sort of, and this is coming a bit from my background before SSE, I was at the UN Global Compact. I don't know how much of that just transition is being looked at in the context of some of the other sectors as well. As we see it sort of coming up in shipping, agriculture as well. But I think, yes, in terms of influencing the energy space, but I think there's a bit more to be done to make sure that that just transition is also potentially ingrained and sort of used as a really helpful framework, as I said, as for other sectors and industries as they're also transitioning into net zero.
Great question, great response. Laura, did you want to add anything to the back of what Martha said there at all? Or?
No, I think Martha's right. I think the energy industry needs to lead the way on that, and we certainly are doing, but it's not for us to solve the problem. Others need to be involved.
I do have a question for you from Esther.
I know, I see. I was reading trying to think.
Got a question from Esther here for you particularly. What challenges do you see in trying to achieve an international standardisation, given the cultural, geographical, and political dimensions of that? That's an amazing question. Over to you, Laura.
Hopefully I can give an amazing response, but we'll see. So yeah, listen, there are challenges. I think maybe touching upon, just because I was at this event yesterday, touching upon the way in which the solar stewardship initiatives coming at it is probably quite a good approach. It's not necessarily global, but we've got the UK and the kind of European arms of solar energy coming together, bringing in this kind of standardization. Now, that will cover a large portion, but I think we have to be recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, right? If we think about standardization, say from a living wage perspective, we've got living wage here in the UK, SSE is a living wage employer. We have operations in Ireland, which obviously sits in the EU, therefore the living wage doesn't apply. So how do you even translate that? And then when we think about, we have now a Southern European business, there is no living wage there. How do we apply that? It becomes really difficult really quickly, and you're never going to get alignment globally, right? What you need to think about is, how do we take the kind of best practice standards, have that as your kind of gold standard, and then how do we approach that sensitively across each of those, bearing in mind that we should never have the same expectations in other countries that we do here in the UK. And I think that's sometimes something that's not always translated particularly well. I think we think that people across the world should be paid and live the way that we do here in the UK, and that's not always going to be the case, because that's not always going to be what's right for the country and what's right for the people. We have to really think about it in a more holistic approach. So I think we do need to recognise that. But I see things coming through now that are certainly more global than maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. But I think again it comes down to maybe doing it at a smaller technology or industry level rather than trying to do it at a big global scale. But yeah, there are challenges, and yeah, I'm glad you didn't ask me for the answer, because I don't think that we have that fully figured out.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was a really great
Eleanor?
question, a great response. Yes.
Helen, I was going to say, can I do a slight plug though, because there is an attempt.
Of course.
So the British standard BS 25700 was launched in January this year. That's BSI's free standard that's used on how you address modern slavery and forced labour in organisations and supply chains. So we led the way with that. It's got a really good framework that's been able to use. But what was really exciting was that very quickly we got consensus on turning that into an international standard. Now, it's not labour rights, but the standard itself is going beyond compliance. It's going into those interconnected aspects, whether it is health and safety, well-being, payments, all those sorts of areas. What was really interesting was when we went out to ballot the nations to find out who wanted this standard and who didn't, we got very strong yeses from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Peru, places in Argentina, South America, countries that everybody's looking at going, I'm scratching my head, working out how we do transparency, how do we get to these areas? The countries that said no, thank you, were Europe, was Germany, were places where they just didn't need it right now. They were looking at human rights, they were looking at the bigger picture rather than worrying about those sort of labour and supply chain issues. So at the table, when we meet in November, we've got, interestingly, and very interestingly, China, Japan, Argentina, Canada, not the US at the moment, Britain, St. Lucia, Peru, and that gives you a flavour of actually how these standards are going to start to be able to build. And these are about organisational approaches. So it's not labour standards. And I think we specifically said it couldn't be labour standards exactly for the points that Laura was talking about. You're never going to get an holistic labour standard. But if you look at the most egregious issues of human rights breaches, like modern slavery, forced labour, exploitation, I think in the main, I could be really ambitious here, we could get most countries to agree that that's at least something that's not acceptable country by country. Going to be interested about China, but they are at the table willing to have the conversation. So that's a little bit of intel that might help as well with some of that international sort of organizational standardization in due diligence and processes.
Yeah, great. And you know, I appreciate, I'm very conscious of time, and I know there's another question, but you know, completely support in terms of that, you know, from our point of view at Slave Free Alliance, you know, that kind of international approach, you know, there isn't one size that fits all. What looks right in one area of the world or industry doesn't necessarily look the same somewhere else. And I think being adaptable to this and being alive, and as you know, SSE have spoken about in terms of that kind of that maneuverability and the understanding of that's really, really important. And unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. Joey, I appreciate there's a question there in terms of the benchmarking and human rights. Maybe we can take that one offline and come back to you. But, you know, really, this is about, for me, in terms of, you know, building that awareness and collaborating in this space, and that kind of overpins, or, you know, the linking into the due diligence in this space as well, and that it transcends wider than, you know, the ESG transcends wider than just the energy sector. It's transcends globally across multiple. I would finally really like to thank my wonderful panelists who have made my job so much easier today, and really appreciate you taking time out to support in the delivery of this webinar for Anti-Slavery Week. So personally from me, thank you so much for that. I think it's been really fruitful, great discussions, and thank you everybody for attending as well. It's been great.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Eleanor.
everyone.
Thank you.
all.
Thanks.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.